The year was 2042. New York City, once a beacon of industry and culture, had become a sprawling, decayed husk of its former self. Overpopulation had turned the metropolis into a concrete labyrinth of suffering, where 50 million souls struggled to survive. The streets teemed with the homeless, pressed together like a writhing mass, sleeping on staircases, in alleys, on the crumbling sidewalks. Food was scarce, water was rationed, and the air was thick with a permanent smog that blocked out the sun. The only thing that kept society from complete collapse was Nutricorp, the government-sanctioned food conglomerate that provided sustenance to the starving masses. Their flagship product, Vital Green, was a miracle. Cheap, nutritious, and readily available. It was the lifeline that kept the populace from turning to cannibalism in the most literal sense. Detective Jack Dawson had seen it all. In his 20 years on the force, he had investigated every crime imaginable: thefts, murders, riots, and the ever-increasing cases of food smuggling. But nothing prepared him for what lay ahead. The call came in late at night. A high-profile murder in the affluent district, where the city's wealthiest still lived in air-conditioned luxury, hoarding what remained of real food. The victim, William Sandwell, a powerful executive at Nutricorp. His body lay in his penthouse apartment, an opulent fortress of excess compared to the world outside. Sandwell had been executed, a single bullet to the head. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle. It was a professional hit, but who would kill a man so crucial to the survival of the city? Jack arrived at the scene with his partner, Frank Delano, a hardened officer who still clung to the ideal of justice in a city where justice no longer had meaning. As they searched the apartment, Jack noticed something odd. Real food. A refrigerator stocked with fresh vegetables, meat, and fruit, luxuries unseen by the common folk in decades. He swiped a bruised apple and bit into it, savoring the rare taste of something authentic. Then he found something more valuable than food, a hidden file. Back at his crumbling apartment, Jack handed the file over to his aging friend and roommate, Arthur Cole, a former historian who spent his twilight years poring over old books and newspapers, desperately trying to remember a time before the world fell apart. Arthur read the file and paled. "Jack, this is impossible. This can't be real." The documents outlined something horrific. The raw materials for Nutricorp's famous Vital Green weren't algae, as the corporation claimed. The truth was much darker. Vital Green was made from people. The dead, the discarded, the weak. Processed, broken down, and repackaged as the only thing keeping the masses from starving. The bodies of the poor had become the food of the living. Jack staggered back. "You're saying we're eating?" Arthur nodded grimly. "Each other." Jack knew that if he had discovered this, someone would be coming for him soon. He needed to act fast. Frank met him at an abandoned police precinct where officers used to be stationed before the government gutted law enforcement in favor of corporate security forces. Jack laid out the evidence. Frank swore under his breath. "If this gets out, the city will tear itself apart." "People have the right to know," Jack said. "You sure about that?" Frank asked. "What happens when they know the only thing keeping them alive is—" He trailed off, shaking his head. But Jack had already made his choice. He was going to expose Nutricorp. Before Jack could act, Nutricorp's private enforcers came for him. A team of armored security officers stormed his apartment, killing Arthur and forcing Jack to flee. He ran through the streets, blending into the endless sea of starving people. He knew the city better than most, its crumbling subways, its abandoned factories, the skeletal remains of its golden age. But Nutricorp's reach was everywhere. Frank helped him escape, but they were running out of time. The corporation had the government, the media, and the police in its pocket. Exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Jack made his way to the last remaining independent journalist in the city, Eleanor Trent, an aging reporter who had spent her career battling censorship and corporate propaganda. She listened to his story and studied the documents. Her face darkened. "If this is true, it means we're worse than animals." Jack nodded. "Will you help me?" Eleanor sighed. "If I don't, no one will." The next day, Eleanor prepared to broadcast the truth. Jack stood guard, knowing Nutricorp would try to silence them. Then the attack came. A strike team stormed the building, shooting Eleanor dead before she could finish the transmission. Jack fought back, taking down several enforcers before making a final desperate escape. Wounded and exhausted, he stumbled into the streets, knowing the truth was lost. Nutricorp had won. But just before his capture, he managed to whisper a final message to a nearby crowd. "Vital green is made from people." The words hung in the air. Some laughed, others looked horrified, but the idea had been planted. Jack was taken away, vanishing into the depths of Nutricorp's secret facilities. But the people had heard, and sooner or later they would rise. Days passed, then weeks. Jack Dorson was never seen again. The city remained unchanged, the poor still starving, the rich still feasting in their glass towers. Vital green continued to flow through the streets, but among the whispers in the alleys and the dark corners of the slums, the story spread. Some believed, others dismissed it as madness. Yet somewhere in the heart of the city, a small group of rebels began to gather, hungry not for food, but for truth. And in the shadows, a revolution was born.